Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Caitlin, and we are going to get started on time. I know that probably a lot of people are going to be joining here in the next few minutes, which very understandable. So a few things I wanted to just go over really quickly in terms of housekeeping. I may mention this a couple times as we go through here, but I do want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable asking questions or sort of how to use the GoToWebinar interface. We, of course, are talking about holiday stress during uncertain times. And what I want to do before we get into the content again is just kind of show you a few ideas of how best to use this to make this as sort of streamlined for you as possible. And if you don't want that panel showing on your screen, you can just click that little arrow in the orange box, and that minimizes or maximizes that panel. Pretty self-explanatory. And then a couple of other things I wanted to mention as well. If you do have questions that you want to communicate with me, we'll definitely have time at the end for some Q&A. Type that into the questions box. You can see that here sort of halfway down this right-hand screenshot where it says questions. If you click that little white arrow, you'll see where you can type in a question. And I have that questions box kind of floating on my screen. And so if anyone types in a question, I'll see that pop up. The main thing that I wanted to make note of, and it's also on the slide here that you can see, is everyone has a different comfort level of asking questions and wanting others to know who asked it. I default to anonymity with that. And so if you do type in a question about the content, or if there's any technical problems, I'll do what I can related to that. But either way, I'm not going to say who asked the question. I'll just say someone asked and then read what it says or summarize what it says. So I don't want anyone to be, afraid to type in a question based on that. So just as a heads up, please feel free to type in questions. Again, if something comes up where you have a follow-up question related to the content as I'm talking about it, you're welcome to type in a question because I'll keep an eye on those. If it's something I can answer right then, great, I will do that. And also I'll leave time at the end for questions as well. Both about EAP services in general, and then also about the content. I would also suggest not to use this hand raise feature. The challenge is we have, I think, up to 50 plus people attending today, and all I see if someone raises their hand is just a sort of a button goes off on this end, and I don't see who raised their hand or why. So I don't want anyone to use that feature just because I don't want someone to feel ignored or that they're not getting their question asked. So do type that in. And then there are a few handouts that are attached to the presentation today. And you can see right here, obviously this is just an example screenshot. But if you go into your panel over there and click on the handouts, there should be 2 PDF files. One of them is just a PDF of the slide deck today. The other one is a form that Cascade put together that is a resource as a handout for you that is more related specifically to the physical safety guidelines during this time, things to consider, things to be aware of. So it's a really good added resource if you wanted more kind of detailed information in terms of what questions might come up related more to the safety, physical safety side of things. So those are resources for you to download if you would like to, but I wanted to make a note of that so you knew that they were there and had plenty of time to download those. And then if anyone misses the webinar that they were hoping to see this live, there's always a recorded version that goes up on our YouTube page, usually a couple days later. So this will be on our YouTube page, or should be in the next couple days if anybody that you know was going to attend and missed it today. And then finally, if there are, or if anyone has willingness to fill out our eval forms, every attendee should get an email with a link to evaluation. So if you're willing to fill that out at the end, we always like to get that feedback. All right, so we'll still have some people joining as we go through here, and that's completely fine. I wanted to have this screen sort of as large as possible while we were going over housekeeping, but now that we've sort of gone over that piece of things, I'm going to turn on my webcam because in this day and age, we're also separated and it's a little bit weird to just have a voice coming from the void. So I am actually here. So let's see if this will all look okay and work all right. All right, there we go. Hello. So I am here. We're all live. And I'm going to move that screen so I'm not staring at myself the whole time. It can get a little bit distracting, a little bit too meta to just teach to myself for the entire presentation. But at least it allows a little bit more personal connection when we're giving these presentations in the days of COVID. Okay, so let's get into the content. Again, I'll probably go for about 40 minutes or so and leave plenty of time at the end if you have questions about the content or about EAP services, because I'd be happy to answer those too. All right. So thinking about the holidays, jumping right in here. And I'm going to go over kind of some information on the slide. And then we also have live polls. They are, of course, completely optional. And the live polls, when I post those, you should see them on your screen. They'll pop up. I'll let you know when I'm going to do that. They're not only optional, but also completely anonymous. Again, so I always encourage everyone to participate in the polls that we do in webinars. And if you are willing to, just be aware that, of course, no one's going to know who answered which one. But that's just a heads up, because we'll have a few of those as we go through here. As much sort of interaction as possible, even though we're not in person. So before we do our first poll, I wanted to kind of go over general holiday stress and what comes up for us. This slide is not necessarily just for 2020. This is in general. So we'll talk, of course, about specific stressors related to the holidays this year too. And there's also a lot of crossover, because what's on this list is still stressful now. But this is, a lot of times every year we give presentations on holiday stress, not just this year. So I think what's happening for this year too is that there's the regular stressors that come up for a lot of people, plus everything else that's going on right now. So this list is with us regardless of the year. So we're looking at, these are the common things that if there's, when we see research about what stresses people out the most, what's coming up for people, and what do we hear when we're talking to groups, or talking to clients, there's a lot of common stressors related to this time. And, this is where I think there's a lot of fear about spending money, how much to spend, gift giving in general, and the pressure behind that, understanding who's getting gifts and for who, and if people are living in different locations, how does shipping work? And there's a lot of stressors with that. The other thing too is really that our normal routine is interrupted. And we do presentations just on coping with change, not related to the holidays and not related to 2020. And that's a very popular, common presentation that we give, because dealing with change is very stressful in and of itself. Because we love having routine generally. It makes us feel like we have a sense of control. It makes us feel like we understand what's going on. And so our brains and bodies really like having that sense of routine a lot of times. And when the holidays come up, a lot of our routine is interrupted. There's, different events. And again, this list goes not just for 2020, but what comes up for people every year. There might be events going on. We have to try to figure out gift giving. Again, all of these different things happening. There might be people visiting in town, or we're traveling somewhere, and planning logistics around that, trying to figure out if you need to take PTO, childcare. There's so many aspects to that. And an interruption to our routine. And this is where I think, it's interesting we're understanding stress related to routine interruption, is that there can be certainly a lot of things that interrupt our routine that are positive, that we're excited about, that we like to do. And it also is stressful because it interrupts our routine. So that's where these two things can be true at the same time. So when I talk about a routine being interrupted causing stress, this doesn't mean that everything we're doing during the holidays is something that someone doesn't want to do or they're not excited about. Certainly not. But it still just adds stress to our day a lot of times. And this is where I think for a lot of people, that aspect of I'm feeling a lot of different feelings right now, because you're maybe excited about some parts of it, stressed about others. And if that is you, you're not alone. And then a lot of us, it can be stressful because we're even more busy then. So not only the routine is interrupted, but we're adding just a busyness to our life, when sometimes a lot of us are already at kind of our point of how busy we can be. And then this, of course, comes up a lot with holidays in general, is either too much or too little togetherness. There's a lot of, I think, social pressure and expectations in terms of what holiday celebrating should look like. And for everyone, they have their own experience with that. And I think there's a lot of stress sometimes around either feeling disconnected from loved ones or feeling stressed because everyone's suddenly together, and that can add stress too. So there's a whole spectrum of things that come up for people with that. We will talk about communication in a little bit. And then overindulgence in eating or drinking. A lot of times, we're eating less healthy. This is also combined with daylight savings time, so even regardless of the holidays, going into the fall, daylight savings time, cold weather, a lot of that healthy eating is impacted. And then, of course, on top of that, COVID and everything else. So just kind of recognizing that piece too. I think at this point, we know how connected our physical health and mental health is. So that lack of healthy eating, for some people, again, I don't want to generalize here, if that happens for some of us during the holidays, that does make an impact on our mental health. So just being aware of that. And speaking of, though, that no one's striving, or we shouldn't be striving for perfection, but a lot of times we are. This goes back to that societal pressure. What is the holiday supposed to be like? How is it supposed to go? I have to plan everything perfectly. I have to still eat my exact same diet through this. There's all this pressure on ourselves, pressure from society. So that adds a lot of stress too. And I like to really kind of add that in terms of, and I'll remind people of this at the end as well, we are not striving for perfection. Even if we just check in on some of the things on this list, that's a huge step in the right direction. And then again, this last bullet point, this is something we talk about every year, not specifically just for COVID, is that holidays can be very hard for people. It reminds us of people we've lost, and any type of holiday or anniversary of any kind can be very triggering emotionally for people. And this goes back to oftentimes a sense of mixed emotions during holidays, is that we have maybe a lot of positive experiences with that time. We might be seeing loved ones or doing activities we enjoy, and also being reminded of those we're lost, that have been lost, and that there's an added challenge. So I see, and I hear a lot of people talk about the holidays are just sometimes kind of this roller coaster of emotions for me, and that in and of itself is exhausting. So if we're thinking about some of these things that happen all the time, before we get into COVID specific stressors, as promised, I wanted to just jump in and do a live poll. So I'm going to launch this poll, and let me make sure that everyone can see it okay. So far, so good. All right, so hopefully you should be able to, yep, people are starting to vote. So I'm just keeping an eye on it over here. Over half of you have already voted. I'll give it a 10, 15 more seconds. So you can think about how you're feeling in terms of your stress level going into the holiday season. Okay, I'm gonna give it 10 more seconds. About 80% of you have voted so far. All right. Okay, I'm gonna close this out and then show you the results. Okay, so as you can see, we have most people at the somewhat high level of stress. I'm not too surprised by that. But one of the things I like about polls, not just with having some type of live interaction on your end too, I think it's helpful in terms of just interacting with the process, is also that you are not alone. So if you feel like I'm gonna vote for, I'm feeling very high stress right now, as you can see in real time, you are not the only person feeling that way. And I'll talk about self-compassion here in a little bit, but that's a big piece of it too, is just sometimes we feel kind of alone in our experience. And I think polls can help remind us that you definitely are not. All right, so that's our first poll, and everyone knows how to participate in them. Thank you for those of you who did. I'm going to close that out, and then let's talk a little bit here about, let's make sure our screen is moving. There we go. Holiday stress during uncertain times. And this first one, I think a lot of this we know, but again, it's back to normalizing this experience. Everything is turned upside down in terms of traveling. So maybe during the holiday season, people traveled to you or you traveled to other people, and that may still be possible in some way or may not be. even if you still can travel, what is that going to look like in terms of the logistics of being physically together then? And how does that work? And again, there's a lot of, like I'd mentioned earlier, because some of you may have joined a little bit later, there's a couple of handouts that are, you can see on that handouts drop down. One of those flyers is specifically about, maintaining physical safety if you are doing things in person with people, if you wanted further specific resources on that. But I do think that there, again, this sort of traveling and being with other people is that twofold stressor. Is it even possible? One, and if it is, what will it look like now? And I wanted to mention this other component here, which is why I talk a little bit about the stat here related to loneliness. And I wanted to make sure to mention that this is before COVID-19 was this research. This is basically saying that before COVID-19, there's been a lot of research recently around loneliness. And as you can see here, we're looking at about half of the US sometimes or always feeling lonely. And this is across the board in terms of generations. And one thing I think that is interesting, kind of understanding that research and understanding loneliness, is that it's extremely stigmatized. And some of the more recent research about it, it was kind of the first time there's been a major conversation around it. I still think it's stigmatized. It's very hard for people to identify that they're feeling lonely because of that stigma. So it's not really talked about. Again, we tend to then feel alone in that experience, which then just kind of perpetuates that. And when we're talking about COVID-19, what's really interesting is that there's loneliness and there's social isolation. And I see those as kind of a Venn diagram of sorts because they're not exactly the same. But it's really about us understanding our own experience with that and what is coming up for us, not just during the holidays, but in general. But I think the holiday times can then just heighten whatever experience we were having before that was happening. So taking some time to check in with ourselves about that. And if we need to seek support, again, I'll talk about EAP support as well as social support here in a moment because it's so important. And how do we, kind of identify that experience? If you feel lonely or if you're feeling lonely during the holidays, again, you're not alone. There's nothing stigmatizing, I want to try to do everything I can to break down that stigma around that. Because as you can see here, it's very common, yet so few people talk about it. So this time of year is especially hard, I think, for a lot of people. And then, of course, during COVID, there's the logistics of gift giving. So figuring out finances around that, figuring out how are we shipping things, how are we doing the same kinds of gifts, whether it's for other adults, whether it's for kids. There's so many factors. And so having a plan in place to kind of plan ahead if here I go, if gift giving is part of a tradition that you do. These are just generalizations. They are not meant to assume that everyone does that. But if that's part of your holiday season, kind of thinking ahead around that, what are my finances right now? Are there different things we could do in terms of how we do gifts this year if that's part of what we do? And I think also, for a lot of people, even though there's the added busyness of the holidays, so many of us look forward to certain events, certain social gatherings related to whatever our holiday traditions are. And those are almost all exclusively not happening this year for understandable reasons in terms of safety. But we can experience grief too. There's a lot of emotional triggers that are coming up for people this year, and just a sense of, we're going into colder weather, it's darker sooner, and then there isn't this excitement around being able to do these types of events. They're getting canceled, and it is hard right now. And I think also just normalizing that a little bit. We don't have to, the goal of this presentation, or when we're talking about this, isn't how do we figure out how to be super happy about what's happening right now. Some of this is having a realistic perspective on this and understanding that this is a really anxious, stressful time for people. And what adjustments do I have to make? How do I take care of myself through this time? And this is not going to look the same as it has before. And it's okay that I'm having an emotional reaction to that. And again, I'd mentioned this last bullet point earlier, but that remembering how difficult changes in our routine are. And so all of those things happen even not in COVID years or these, super stressful year that we're in right now. And then on top of that, we're trying to figure out other things. For many people, they are suddenly working from home, maybe that they weren't before, or they're an essential worker and trying to figure out safety around that, trying to figure out childcare and homeschooling and those things. So there's a million other things that are happening that massively interrupted our routine. Now we're trying to figure out, okay, well, if we normally give gifts, what is that going to look like? Are we still trying to travel? Are people coming here? There's a ton of things happening. And if you're like, I don't know if I feel great right now, you are totally not alone. So what are some general, symptoms of stress and anxiety? When I encourage people to think about what is coming up for you, how are you feeling right now? And, sometimes I'll ask someone, how are you feeling? They'll say, I'm feeling like I don't have enough time in the week to get all the things done that I want to get done. That's very valid, although that's a thought, not a feeling. So sometimes when I really want to think about how do I practice self-care right now? How do I check in on what I'm feeling? Check in with the physical symptoms too. This is not an exhaustive list over here. These are just some examples. I think for a lot of people, sleep is a major issue right now. And, we just notice that restlessness, we have trouble concentrating, which then if we're trying to plan extra logistics during the holidays, while we're under added anxiety and we're wondering why we can't concentrate very well, there's a reason for that. The other thing that I think comes up a lot are some of the behavioral symptoms. We may oftentimes notice we're feeling more irritable, other people are feeling more irritable. Irritability is sometimes kind of covering up anxiety, other emotions underneath it. And for us to kind of check in with ourselves of, I'm going to need a break here. I need to take a break and give myself some time for self-care. I can see some of these symptoms coming up. So part of that self-awareness is just checking in with ourselves, not in a judgmental way, just in a way of, I need to check in and be present enough to figure out what I need and to be able to support those around me too. And I think part of this goes back to that perfectionism, which is why I put this quote on here, because I do, again, think that there are just so many pressures around, I need to make it a perfect, COVID holiday season. Like we still are striving for perfection, and there can be a lot of pressure around that, a lot of fears of not doing the right thing, especially when it's related to holidays. We'll talk about social media here in a little bit, but that just adds to the stress and anxiety. So I would start with checking in on how am I feeling about all of this? What do I need? What symptoms are coming up? And we'll do a few mindfulness techniques here momentarily. Okay, I think we have another poll question. So let's do that really quickly. Okay. See, you should see it there. So if you want to answer this or not, if anyone's interested, you can see the poll is up there. And we've got a few people voting. Oh yeah, here come the votes. All right, almost half of you have already voted. So I'm just keeping an eye on how many people we have. We'll give it a few more moments. I realize these are just some examples. You may have something else that's not on this list, but we're getting pretty interesting results so far. So I'll give it about 10 more seconds and then show the results, because I think sometimes it's just trying to take a second and like, what is stressing me out right now? And I probably could have put all of the above. So if that's how you feel, that's understandable. All right, so a little over half of you voted. I'm going to share the results here so you can see what we've got. Okay, so this is where, I was curious what was going to come up in terms of this poll, and it looks like, literally half of you who voted, which over half total voted, and then half of you from that is related to that physical safety due to COVID. I would really encourage you to look over that handout that's attached to the handouts here on GoToWebinar that you can download the PDF, because that goes into way more detail about all different pieces of information, suggestions related to physical safety during the holiday season, because that is, of course, understandable. And then we have the other half kind of split between that separation from loved ones and then figuring out how to handle the, added tasks. It looks like finances is less of a stressor. So, I think that what we'll talk about in the rest of these slides will definitely kind of focus on what people voted for on here or chose on here. So hopefully we'll have time to go over some of strategies around that and then some Q&A at the end. All right. Okay, so this I wanted to just touch base on because, again, not even during COVID, this is a common stressor for people, how to, you know, manage the interpersonal interactions during the holidays with family, loved ones, and then now there's the added stress of COVID. So one thing that I, oftentimes talk about is this idea of dialectics, which means two things can be true at the same time. And one thing that's come up, not just during the holidays, but in general as it relates to COVID, is people talking about it's been hard because either someone I'm living with, spouse, partner, roommate, etc., or coworkers, whatever the setup is in terms of people we're, oftentimes around, have a very different response to how they feel about what's going on, how they handle what's going on. And all of us react to stress differently. And what can happen sometimes is we'll think either, I'm not that stressed about it. Why are they so stressed about it? Or the reverse. They seem fine with this. Why am I so stressed? So there's oftentimes we compare ourselves to others. We judge our own emotional state or sometimes others' emotional state because it's not the same as our own. And that is hard to reconcile sometimes. And then if we go into the holidays and it's trying to figure out, are we doing stuff in person with other people? Is everyone on board with that? What if some people are and some people aren't? How do we have a communication about that? And what are the expectations here? Some people may say, based on whatever the holiday traditions are or activities, let's just do it the way we did before. Again, others may be like, I'm not comfortable with that. And we all fall in a different spectrum of how comfortable we are sharing how comfortable we are, if that makes sense. And so this is back to checking in with ourselves, being honest about what we need and what our experience is, as well as listening to other people, practicing, empathy. We can be empathetic and listen to others' perspectives and still set boundaries. So we could do an entire presentation just on boundaries. I say that in almost all of my presentations. But one thing that comes up is this acronym, which stands for fear, obligation, and or guilt, as you can see on here. And I think what I will hear people talk about this a lot, or I'll see this, when I'm working with people or during trainings back in the day when it used to be in person, or people would type in questions related to this. What if someone says, I can't believe you're not coming to this event, everyone else is, that type of thing. That's where there's that sense of that obligation of like, now I feel guilty and I feel obligated to go. And sometimes when the person says that to us, they don't even realize they're kind of sending that message. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. So it's more about kind of what our experience is. And I think it's being very careful about, if I'm agreeing to do something or participate in something, why is that? And if I'm feeling like it's just because of a sense of obligation or feeling guilty, why don't I check in with myself really quickly and figure out, do I want to go to this? Do I have to go to this? There may be things like I have to go to work or whatever the fact may be. But maybe there are things that I don't have to go to. And is there a way I can communicate my needs, suggest alternatives? That's always a really helpful way of kind of having those conversations. And then this is where the I statement piece comes in. And it's interesting because I've talked about I statements a lot. Probably a lot of you have heard that term before. Many, many years ago, I used to run group therapy groups. And early in my career, I was like, I'm going to talk about I statements and this is going to be great, And I talked to the group, speak from your own experience, I feel, etc. And the next week, that group came back, and one of the individuals from the group, he was like, I've been practicing I statements all this week and it's been going so great. I was like, awesome. Can you give me an example? He's like, I just told my girlfriend, I think you're being a huge jerk, So I was like, all right, that is the loophole when it comes to I statements. So whenever I talk to people about I statements, I try to really make sure that we're not taking it too literally. What I statements really are describing is that we're speaking from our own experience. We're not describing someone else or talking about them. So just putting I at the beginning of a sentence does not mean it's necessarily an appropriate I statement or really what it means. So what I try to think about, if someone's saying, you're not coming to the, event next week, everybody else is, like, why wouldn't you do that? And we, instead of getting defensive, instead of, trying to talk about your feelings about other people going to that or not, try to focus from your own experience. I, of course, am sad I can't go. And also, I'm really focused just on my own safety, and my comfort level is to, not attend in person right now. And that's where we're just speaking from our own experience. And part of setting boundaries, we aren't there to judge someone else. People can make up their own minds about what they want to do. And so that's where I try to really focus on that I statement piece. And we can practice empathy, hear someone's side of things, and still set a boundary. And boundaries are not mean. I think there's a lot of sort of misconceptions around that. Setting boundaries when we do so in a respectful way is actually not only respecting us, but other people too. So for many people, not just around the holidays, but in general, setting boundaries, speaking from our own experience, communicating during difficult conversations is hard for most people. But this is where we practice that, and we work on that as much as possible. So I'm going to just kind of jump in here and do our last live poll. This is the last one. And so I just wanted to kind of see where people are at on this. So this one's just asking how confident you feel in your general communication skills. So we're not talking just about boundaries, but just in general, how comfortable are you or confident are you in your communication skills? Just kind of get a breakdown here, see how people are feeling. We've got a lot of you voting. Votes were coming in right away. And almost 60% of you have voted so far. Oh, even more than that. Oh, look at that. We're at like 75% voted. A lot of you are voting on this one, so I appreciate it. All right, I'll give it 10 more seconds because we've got almost 80% of you have voted. We've got a pretty good breakdown here. All right, so let me close that up, and then I will share the results here. All right, so we have sort of across the board. And again, if you've answered any of those 3 that people answered, you're not alone in that. And as you can see, a lot of you are in those middle 2. So somewhat agree to somewhat disagree. That is not surprising. So the results I'm seeing here are not surprising. And a lot of times what I'll hear someone say is, yeah, I'm really good at communicating when everyone's in a good mood. But what happens is that during the holidays, we are extra stressed, we're tired, we are trying to figure out logistics, we're trying to juggle a million things, plus COVID, so concerns about that. Everyone has different opinions about events and how those should go this year. And so that's where that irritability comes in. That's where that sort of struggle with emotion management comes in. And as soon as we're feeling stressed, we're feeling triggered, then our balanced I statements start to go away. So that's where it's really checking in with ourselves, practicing, taking, some time to, check in, practice mindfulness. And we will, in a moment here, talk about some mindfulness techniques. So what are a few things to just think about? And some of these we've kind of touched on a little bit already, but this is where it's setting realistic expectations. When we think about the idea of resilience, what I sometimes hear in resilience being defined is I hear the term bounce back. I tend to not use that terminology because I think a lot of times we tell ourselves, I won't feel okay until things are exactly how they were before. And one of the challenges with that is that some things may not look exactly how they used to be in the past. That is not meant to be doom and gloom. There are a lot of things that are going to go back to how they were before as well. But when we get stuck in this sort of externalizing our well-being, I won't feel okay until this thing is this way, to make a rhyme out of it. So that's where I try to really fixate on, maybe fixate is a strong word, but think about how am I present right now? And how am I practicing sort of a realistic approach here to what things are going to look like? And that's going to be challenging, that's going to be stressful, and also I trust that we can get through this. So let's set some realistic expectations. Number one, things are not going to look exactly the same this year in a lot of ways, probably. And then how are we rethinking traditions that we may celebrate? Some of you may have traditions you celebrate in the holiday season, some may not. But if there are things that you typically do during the holiday season, what are ways that you can still create a tradition? It might look different, but the focus here is really the process beneath it. So the content of the tradition, which may be, going to a certain event out downtown or whatever that is, may not be possible. But what was the purpose behind that? What was the goal behind that? Was it spending time together? Was there a certain, thing that everyone enjoyed watching together? If it was going to an event, how can we make that look different, but still have that sense of what that tradition's purpose was? So how do we stay connected to that idea behind the meaning of the tradition? And this is not only just for kids, obviously, but adults too. We love, I think, oftentimes having that sense of tradition, that way that we can share those experiences with others in a positive way. And so it's planning some of those expectations of what things can look like. And that, I think, can help us feel more resilient, more optimistic. And optimism doesn't mean I'm happy all the time, everything's perfect. Optimism is really about hope. It's about feeling resilient. It's about feeling like we can get through this. And what do we do in the interim where we can still feel connected? And then again, I know I'd mentioned this already, you have the handout available to you, but of course there's still going to be in-person events for a lot of people. So making sure that, you have all the plans and logistical plans around that related to safety for that. And then we'd mentioned already some of that gift giving options and what is that going to look like this year if that's part of what you do. All right, so we're going to do a quick 3-step relaxation because it's fun to talk about. Let's try to relax, but everyone's like, great, how could I do that? So we're going to do it right now, and it is going to take maybe 5 seconds, and you don't need to do anything, really. You don't have to move. Just if you would like to, and I invite you to do this, is 3 things. First, you're going to close your eyes. Second, you're going to drop your shoulders. And third, you're going to relax your jaw. And that's it. For many of us, we don't even realize how much stress we're holding. We hold our emotions in our body. They are emotions, energy in motion. They are held in our physical body. And we are busy and distracted throughout the day and forget sometimes how much of that tension we are holding on to. And 2 very common places we hold tension is in our shoulders and our face and our jaw. And for many of you, maybe the second you did those 3 things, you realized how much you were holding. What I like about things like this is you can do it right away. No one knows you're doing it. You can do it as often as you need to. And even just doing that allows us to check in with our physical body. How much tension am I holding right now? And can I try to do some physical regulation for that? Because what we're talking about is distress tolerance. And a lot of times I hear, I want to try to make the holidays in a way that there's just no anxiety, or I want to make sure that I set this up so it's not going to be stressful. And we can do a lot of planning to try to reduce that. And also, as we all know, things come up that we could have never expected. And that is where our ability to tolerate distress, tolerate adjustments to things comes into play. These are a few questions I think can be helpful to ask ourselves if we're feeling distressed. What is my body trying to tell me? We just did a 3-step relaxation. Where am I holding tension? Why is it there? And then also I like to put things on a scale. So from 1 to 10, how anxious am I feeling? And it doesn't necessarily mean that our goal has to be 0 anxiety, but regulating emotions is about, even if you were saying I'm at a 6 out of 10 on anxiety, what could I do right now to even just move it to a 5? That's where it's also realistic expectations of our ability to self-regulate. We can't go into perfection mode of I'm going to cope perfectly with this year. I'm going to handle this perfectly. I'm going to exactly, do self-care in a way that is perfect all the time. We are learning, we are figuring things out as we go. And then taking some time, a lot of times if we're communicating with other people and we're feeling triggered, we're feeling stressed out, we tend to be more reactive. So we don't think as much before we say something. And then later we're like, I don't think I said that the way I wanted to. Even if you take 3 seconds before responding, that's an enormous amount of time to give yourself a moment before choosing how to respond. And the space, again, between stimulus and response is where all of that ability to regulate ourselves comes into play. So really taking that time, and that's for your benefit as well as other people's too. So how do I look at the situation from a different perspective? This is really coming into play this year. because earlier on the slide with those worst case scenario, our brain goes into that mode, especially when there's a global pandemic. So trying to step back and do kind of a reality check on some of our automatic thoughts. If they're going into worst case scenario, how can I look at this a little bit more realistically? And how do I practice some mindfulness? So what are some things we could do? Try to find the most relaxing, calming holiday image I could find. So that's what's on this slide. So there's some things here to practice if they work for you or not. One of the things I like about trying different coping skills, and I encourage others to do this, is that some things are really effective for some people, some are not. And that's where it's testing some of those out and figure out what works for you. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, similar to that relaxation exercise we did already. All you're doing is checking in with the 5 senses. But the way that I usually do it is 5 things you can see, and that's just wherever you are at the time. So right now it would be like, oh, maybe my cell phone or a computer mouse. 4 things you can physically feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things that you can smell or like the smell of. And then for 1, what I typically do is 1 thing I'm grateful for. And that is part of mindfulness, is being present. And again, a lot of times we're feeling anxious or stressed. We are not present. We are thinking about what's going to happen next week. We're not physically present. So doing a physiological grounding exercise like that is helpful. Progressive muscle relaxation, this can help with sleep sometimes. You're just laying down. What you essentially do is you tense up your muscle groups. I usually start at the feet and work my way up, and you would tense up, your muscles in your feet, say for 2 or 3 seconds, and then completely relax and do that all the way up. What that's doing by first tensing up those muscle groups is then when you relax them, you get that full sense of relaxation. And for some people, that helps them fall asleep, not only because it gives you kind of that relaxation in all those muscle groups, it gives your brain a task because you have to figure out like which muscle group is next. I'm counting to 3. And when we are anxious and we can't fall asleep, oftentimes it's because our mind is racing. So giving our mind a task at that time can help too. Gratitude lists are very effective. They've actually done research around this related to people with depression diagnoses. And if you do a gratitude list, they had a group of people do 3 new things, and new is an important piece of that. 3 new things they were grateful for every night for 3 months. That group of people actually had the same average reduction in depression symptoms as the group who was taking depression medication. That's not to say that depression medication is not helpful, but what it's talking about is that we have the ability to rewire our brain. And doing gratitude lists is a really important piece for a lot of people in terms of just how we the lens we use to see the world and our experiences in it. Guided imagery, there's a ton on YouTube. You can download guided imagery, audio, mindfulness audio, all of those things. That's also helpful for sleep a lot of times, or if you just need 5 minutes. I think a lot of times with mindfulness, people assume that it requires like an hour of mindful meditation. That's awesome if that's something you do, but that can be daunting for a lot of people, both just time-wise and how am I supposed to sit like that, and after 2 minutes I'm anxious again. Start really small. So even if you did that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, or you can find guided imagery or guided meditations on YouTube for 5 minutes or less sometimes, just enough to give yourself kind of a check-in and calm down. And then radical acceptance, when I talk about this, I think there's oftentimes a misconception that acceptance in this term means that we're okay with something. It's actually not what that term means. It comes from DBT, which is a certain type of evidence-based therapy. Radical acceptance is basically the opposite of denial. So what radical acceptance is talking about is that we are willing to at least accept that a situation is what it is right in that exact moment. We're not denying it or avoiding it. So it doesn't mean we're okay with it, but that ability to even change our plans because of new things that are happening, we have to at least acknowledge that that's going on so we can then plan accordingly. And I think all of this self-care has to be through a lens of self-compassion. We tend to practice self-care through, the perspective of, why are you so stressed? No one else seems as stressed, or why can't you deal with this better? There's so much negative self-talk that comes up a lot, especially when we're anxious. And so I always try to encourage people to think about self-care. It needs to be through the lens of self-compassion. And one sort of mantra that I think about sometimes is to ask myself, How are you feeling right now? You're doing the best you can. What do you need? And just even allowing ourselves space to say, you're doing the best you can, or I'm doing the best I can. What do I need right now? And when we think about what do I need, I like to break it down into these categories. What do I need in different areas? Because sometimes someone will say, I'm just completely overwhelmed. I don't even know what I need. And that's okay if that's where you're at. But sometimes I like to then take it to a level of, all right, why don't I break it down in different categories? Is there something I need logistically? Do I need help with someone picking something up from the store? Do I need help with someone planning some logistics around travel? What do I need mentally? Maybe I need to do one of those guided imagery to just get my mind off of what it's spinning about. What do I need socially? And this is where it's talking about this resilience and vulnerability. We are all, this goes back to that sense of loneliness, that sense of disconnection many of us are feeling. What can I do to try to touch base with a loved one, a friend? You know, when was the last time I talked to this person? We've all been so busy. How can I, be proactive in terms of putting those connections in place? And then what do I need emotionally? Maybe I'm feeling super anxious. Maybe I've noticed that lately. What are some emotional coping skills I can put in place? And narrowing down what we need can sometimes help with that. And being resilient during this time, the holidays are so stressful, is asking for help. If it's hard to ask for help, to try to push through that a little bit. Being vulnerable is really hard, but that human connection piece, that's a big component of it. And so remembering, what do I need right now, and how am I accessing my support system? So some final thoughts. A lot of these we already went over, but it's just kind of that final list. Remember that no one's going for perfection. This is a crazy year. Holidays included in that. Everyone's doing the best they can. This is not going to look the same as it probably did for your holidays in the past, whatever those looked like for you. And I think also this is when I touched on social media earlier, talk about comparing ourselves to others. So I think one of the big things is checking in with ourselves of how often am I using social media, and is it restorative to me or anxiety inducing? And if it's becoming anxiety inducing, that goes back to boundaries, which is also on this list. I find a way to just include it on almost any list. I need to set boundaries with myself right now, because if this is not a restorative experience going on social media, then I need to take a break from it. And we sometimes have to intentionally put our phone in the other room for a while. We've all been doom scrolling, as we probably all know what that term means. We've heard it a lot, where even if it's not social media, it's like we're scrolling through the news and there's just a lot of negative things or negative, stressful things going on. And we do sometimes need to take a break from that, especially during the holidays when there's extra stress. Slowing down, this is back to that mindfulness practice, focusing on what we can control. That's a big piece, because anxiety comes from a lack of a sense of control. There are a lot of things right now that we don't have control over. What is something I do have control over? That can be another mantra that can help. That it's completely normal if you're not feeling great right now. Remaining in the present moment as much as possible, trying to take it one day at a time. Whenever possible, think about, eating healthy. And again, this is not meant to imply that any of us are perfect or have to stick to some specific regimen, but just kind of, I think this is more about just our general physical health, which is connected to our mental health. And so what does that look like for me? How do I practice that through a lens of self-compassion and checking in with myself? Stay connected to other people. Practicing gratitude can be really helpful and powerful as well, as we'd mentioned. And then for some people, this is the last thing I just wanted to mention here. A lot of times it's like, yep, I'm trying all that mindfulness stuff. I'm trying to stay present. I'm trying to take some things off my plate, and I'm still having a really difficult time. If that's your experience, as this says on the slide, I promise you're not alone. That is where EAP can help. And even though it's a global pandemic, there are still counselors doing telehealth, licensed counselors. All of your EAP services are still available to you. And one thing as well, along with counseling, is that you have part of what EAP does is help with resources. So if you need help trying to figure out daycare or elder care questions, any type of resources where you're either I don't know where to start with this, nor do I have time, call us and we can help you find those resources. So really in the end, EAP, if there's almost anything that you have questions about or need support around, the EAP can help. So if you need further support, if you notice that you're, trying to cope with these times and it's still really difficult, come to us. We can absolutely support you and provide some extra resources for that. All right, so we made it to the questions section. I'm going to jump to the next slide that has our contact info, not because I'm skipping the questions. And also during the Q&A, I'm going to turn my camera off because what happens when I leave it on is I lean in to read questions and then it's like, whoa, she's leaning in real close to that screen. So I'm turning my camera off, but I am not leaving. So I'm still here. But if you have questions about either EAP services or about the content that we went over, if there's anything that you wanted more information on or something that's going on that you want to ask about, please type that into the Q&A. We have, about 10 more minutes left, so plenty of time if there's something that you do have a question about. And while I'm keeping an eye on if there's any that's coming up, just as a reminder, if anyone did know someone who missed today's webinar, this will be up on YouTube fairly soon. Please download both of the handouts that are there if you'd like those. Again, there's a lot of resources on there that are good for these times. And the other thing that's nice about the EAP, which is why I put our contact info slide up, is that especially during COVID, I think it's been, a question of if I want to set up services and I'm trying to call, how do I contact you? And there's different ways to contact us. So someone had asked to repeat the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise. So that would be 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 you can hear, 2 that you can smell or like the smell of, and then 1 thing that you're grateful for. And I like to just, do that as needed. When we think about coping skills, I do think what's helpful is understanding that there's a difference between external coping skills and internal coping skills. External would be something like calling a friend, taking a dog for a walk. Internal, we can do anytime, it's just there as accessible. And so I think that is helpful too. It's like we might be in the middle of some stressful situation. We can't immediately get up and call a friend, but we can do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise because no one knows we're doing it. And then there was a question about EAP benefits in here. So every organization they're asking about like when their sessions renew. For most people, that's every calendar year, but not necessarily, since sometimes different companies have a renewal date that's different. And so what I would encourage you to do is if you have questions about your specific benefit, just because this webinar is for all groups, to make sure you're getting the most updated, accurate information, you can email us, you can text in and check on that, you can call our main number, and you can also log in. If you go to cascadecenters.com and you log in as a member, then you can live chat with someone and get that information for sure. But yeah, good question. I think it's good to kind of know what your benefits are and how that works, absolutely. And yeah, I hope that some of the coping skills, some of the, at least a starting point to kind of think about, what do I need? We're all in this together. I'm doing the best I can. Even small things to help myself and support myself through this process is a big thing. And I think that, it's good to talk about this. It's good to normalize some of the stress and get some strategies in place for sure. So I don't have any other questions coming through. Again, this will be on YouTube if anyone wants to see it later. If you have time to fill out the evaluation form, please do so. And I hope that everyone has a safe and happy holiday season, and take care.